I decided I wanted to do a commentary on chapters 15 and 16 of the Lotus Sutra together because I think they're intimately linked. And as I have been doing, I will use the Hurvitz preface to give some sense of the summary of each of those chapters. What Hurvitz says about chapter 15 is that countless bodhisattvas from all over the universe come to pay homage to the Buddha and to receive his commission to propagate the lotus. The Buddha explains to his listeners that the number of bodhisattvas whom he has so commissioned is literally incalculable. Maitreya then asks the Buddha how that could have been possible in the short space of the Buddha's preaching career. So, to refresh you regarding the context of this fantastic development, you'll recall that the stupa of abundant treasures has appeared, and that Sakyamuni Buddha has sort of magically arisen into the air to be at the level of abundant treasures, the long thought extinct Buddha who now is apparently existent at the top of this stupa, and he invites Sakyamuni to sit next to him in this great stupa. And this is after Sakyamuni has called all the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas who are emanations from him from all over the universe to witness this amazing stupa, which Abundant Treasures has appeared in order to hear Sakyamuni preach the Lotus Sutra. This is a statue of the two Buddhas, Sakyamuni and Abundant Treasures, sitting next to each other in the great stupa. So, anyway, in this chapter, all the bodhisattvas who are in the assembly are totally enamored by the preaching of Sakyamuni regarding the Lotus Sutra, and they all commit themselves to carry on after his extinction to continue preaching it. And what he says basically is not necessary. And then magically again, up comes from under the earth a whole retinue of incalculable numbers of bodhisattvas, great bodhisattvas, who are whom Sakyamuni indicates that he can rely upon to preach the sutra, so that he doesn't need all the other bodhisattvas who are in the assembly. And by the way, just as a sidebar, but an important sidebar, that there are 4 particular bodhisattvas who are heading up this retinue that has come out from under the ground. And one of those is a bodhisattva whom Nichiren, the Japanese, 13th century Japanese Buddhist master, identified with, and he, of course, was the founder of the Nichiren school of Buddhism, which later spawned the Soka Gakkai group that is very active now in propagating and expanding its numbers in the West. So, anyhow, Maitreya, who is said to be the Buddha of the future and is part of the assembly which has witnessed this amazing development, is a bit befuddled, and as are the rest of the 4 groups, the monks, the nuns, the lay men, the lay women who are observing all this, in terms of the fact that, from their point of view, Sakyamuni was enlightened 40 some years ago under the Bodhi tree and has been preaching for 40 some years. So who has trained and groomed and mentored all these bodhisattvas that have come from under the earth? And it's unbelievable to them to some extent that Sakyamuni himself claims that he, in fact, was the Buddha that under whom that these bodhisattvas were groomed and trained. Well, Maitreya asks Sakyamuni to explain this. Apparently, he and the rest of the assembly now, on the basis of Sakyamuni's claims and his testimony that he is the one who trained these bodhisattvas, that they are now convinced of it and have faith in that testimony. But Maitreya is concerned about people in the future, frankly, like us, in terms of whether or not people in the future, bodhisattvas in the future, will have trouble believing that all these billions and billions and billions of bodhisattvas over eons and eons of time could have been trained by this one Buddha, namely Sakyamuni. Which really leads then into chapter 16, which is one of the key chapters in the Lotus Sutra, the chapter on the eternal life of the Buddha. And while I have been reciting primarily out of the Gene Reeves translation from Wisdom Publications, I may recite the Eternal Life Sutra, which I have not yet done, from the Rishikosai Threefold Lotus Sutra, just simply because that's the one that early on in my Buddhist career that I was most enamored of and feels in many ways most familiar to me. So in that chapter 16, the Buddha replies that the commonly accepted notions about a Buddha's lifespan and teaching career have no ultimate truth, that the Buddha is in fact limitless in both time and space, assuming various forms in different ages and under different circumstances, but all for the same purpose, namely the salvation of the beings. He illustrates this with the following parable. A physician who had been away from home a long time returned to find his sons suffering from an ailment. He prescribed for them an appropriate medicine, which certain of them took, but which others, mad from the poison, refused. Those who took it were immediately cured, while the others continued to languish in their malady. The physician accordingly went away and circulated the rumor that he had died. This shocked the ailing sons back to their senses, after which they too took their father's medicine and were cured. When he heard of this, the father made his appearance again. So Hurvitz goes on to say, just so, says the Buddha, are the beings. When offered salvation, some of them refuse it. So the Buddha stages nirvana. This instills in them a sense of urgency, born of the fear that the Buddha will not always be among them. But for this, certain of the beings would continue forever to forego their own salvation. But the true reality, according to the teaching in the 16th chapter of the Lotus Sutra, is that the Buddha has existed for eons past, and the Buddha will continue to exist for immeasurable eons in the future. Well, this is a long way from Buddhism as taught by the historical Sakyamuni Buddha and as reflected in the Theravadan teachings of the Pali Canon. In a way, it's in many ways the diametrical opposite of some of the teachings in the early form of Buddhism. But if you take as a premise that the intent of the Buddha is to address the suffering of beings, and if it's the case, which I think it is, that most humans have a difficult time accepting some of the basic notions, the wonderful notions, the true notions within the Pali Canon, of the ideas of impermanence, that everything is impermanent, that there is no self, and that life is suffering inevitably because because of impermanence to some extent, that things will change, we will experience loss and so forth, and that this is hard to stomach, this is hard for humans to accept at a deep level. Humans have a longing for the eternal, have a longing for there to be something more in the universe in terms of a comforting kind of force or dynamic. And this has not gone unnoticed by the Buddha and by the authors of the Mahayana Sutras, this later form of Buddhism, which promulgates this notion of an eternal Buddha. And again, this has given great comfort to beings. It has also stimulated and inspired great artistic creations. And so it's really up to each individual as to whether or not he or she sees benefit and receives comfort or pleasure from this notion. But here it is in the Lotus Sutra being preached, that the Buddha is eternal and is always here, and that his land, his pure land, is available to us. Now, whether you would choose to view that pure land as a place where we are reborn when we die, or whether you view it as something that's existent in the here and now, if we could only become aware of it by transcending the ignorance, the greed, the anger that's a part and parcel of our human attributes. Either way, these are, as we saw in Chapter 2 of the Lotus Sutra, expedient means. These are different modes of teaching, and this teaching of the eternal life and availability of the Buddha as a source of comfort and support is one of the most widely accepted modes of teaching among human beings in the course of our history as a species.